I wonder if we are just ideas born into the light, shimmering with energy before we return to the night. Poem by Natalie Field.
The concepts in my work are driven by a desire to reconnect humans, including myself, with the natural world at this crucial moment when the planet is experiencing a devastating loss of biodiversity due to anthropomorphic machinations.
Welcome to The Artful Exchange, the podcast where we dive into the fascinating world of design, creativity, and innovation. I'm your host, the poetic designer from Winter Design, and I am so excited to present our guest joining us here today. Natalie Field is an artistic researcher and interdisciplinary artist from South Africa with a core interest in Psi art. Her practice is situated in the field of speculative taxidermy as she questions how man-made representations of and cultural ideas about the animal, other influences our ethical, social and ecological behaviour towards the living world. I have for long now been following Natalie's work, and I am super intrigued by her way of representing the natural world as a bioserialist, and not least through her interdisciplinary approaches, which is very much the way I too like to see works of artists come alive. She's here now with us today to share her journey and insights and the story behind her career and what led her to coming to Norway. Welcome, Natalie, and thank you so much for joining us today. Can you please tell us more about yourself and what brings you to Norway?
Thank you so much for having me, Tanya. I'm excited to be here and share my work with your listeners. What can I say about myself? I'm just a girl who likes to play with sticks and stones and skins and bones. Yeah. I was born in Gqeberha, formerly known as Port Elizabeth, on the eastern coast of South Africa, and spent my formative years in this general area. And then when it became time to make career choices, I wanted to study something in the line of art and design. Like I knew I wanted to be somewhere in that field. And I opted for photography because it seemed like a sensible choice for creating an opportunity to be financially stable while also having a outlet for artistic expression. So I went for a tour at the Nelson Mandela University in my hometown, and went to the photo department there to see kind of what it was all about. And the lecturer at the time asked me questions like, do you like to spend time on your own? Because photography can be a very solo gig. Or, do you mind having your hands stain yellow from the chemicals? Because yes, that was still in the time of analog. I am that old. And so I promptly decided I'm going to study fashion design.
Oh, wow.
And I did that for 3 weeks, and then I dropped out because it wasn't for me. And scandalous, I know, my mother wasn't happy at all. So I ran away to the UK and I did a 2-year working visa to get some life experience instead.
The plot thickens.
Yeah, and so that was obviously a life-changing experience, and I met such wonderful people. I moved around from place to place and I ended up staying in a hostel where I met backpackers, and they introduced me to this concept of traveling, and that really had such a big influence on the trajectory of my life. I traveled extensively during my 2 years in the UK, and after that I backpacked in Southeast Asia for a whole year. And I must say it was during these travels that I actually fell in love with photography. Like I didn't really know what it was before. And that's also when I first came to this idea of observation as conservation. How can we influence people by just allowing them to see the world in a different way, maybe? Then of course I ran out of money and I had to return to South Africa. And so what to do then but study, you guessed it, photography. So I ended up with the same lecturer at the same university, have come full circle somehow, but at least now I knew that I loved spending time on my own, and I was ready to, get my hands dirty. Yeah. So it kind of worked out for the best. A bit of a detour.
Traveling really does help us remind us who we are, doesn't it, in a way?
I think
in
we
a sense.
find ourselves that we didn't even
Maybe
know
so.
we existed in there.
Yeah. And you found yourself?
Well, I continue to find myself every day. I think there is no end to the things that we can discover about ourselves if we are brave enough to keep looking. But we digress. So for my bachelor's, I focused on the cinematic tableau, an influence which I do also think you can still see in my work today. And then shortly after I graduated, I moved to Johannesburg, where I started field photography, which naturally developed into a small creative agency.
How fun.
Yeah, it was fun, but it was also literally selling consumerism. And that's not something I'm really all that in agreement with. I feel like the artist in me had other stories to tell. So alongside the commercial work, I also started creating lens-based art. And I was signed with a local gallery, Burman Contemporary. Had my first show with them in 2018. And at that time, I actually remember telling people that I was thinking about doing a master's in fine art, specifically in Norway. But it wasn't until the pandemic hit that I think I found the time, but also most certainly the motivation to actually prepare my application. But yes, to answer your question, that is what brings me to Norway.
Wow. Okay. So you had heard about the Art Academy in Trondheim, Norway then?
I had not actually, but what I had heard was that it was free tuition for foreigners to study higher education in Norway. And that certainly piqued my interest.
But not the case anymore, though, for many, unfortunately.
No, sadly, that has changed in the last year. So the course that I did is now just under 1 million kroner to complete for the 2 years. I'm very lucky that I made the decision to come when I did, because I could never have known that that was going to change so suddenly. And it was very sudden. So I feel like I got really lucky. And I'm very fortunate to be here.
It was meant to be. And today you can call yourself a skin and bone artist because you went from photography to working with taxidermy. Now, how does one actually make that transition?
Yeah, believe it or not, the transition actually came quite naturally. My art has thematically always revolved around this human-nature connection. So sometimes I work in situ in the landscape, like when I do cinematic tableau, but other times I will literally drag the whole of nature home with me, collecting flowers and insects and birds and nests and eggs and things like that. And then I either photograph them and use them in collages, or I press them and use them in cyanotypes. But I was doing an artist residency at the Atelier's Creative Center in Finland in 2016. And there I found some skins and antlers in the attic, which I used in my art. And then later also in South Africa, I started borrowing skull collections from friends to use, for example, in the series Macabre. Yeah.
Oh, so when did you create this exactly, the Macabre series? And can you maybe elaborate a bit more what that series is about?
Yeah, that was a long project from 2018 to 2022. Might still be ongoing, we don't know. Yeah, so that was a citizen science project in which I gathered as much information as I could of the various species within a 1 kilometer radius around my house in Johannesburg. I managed to identify over 100, which I think is pretty impressive.
Wow, that's very impressive indeed.
Yeah, and so then each species would be photographed, either on a black background, or if it was in nature, then it would be deconstructed and removed from the background. And then I used these images to create large-scale hypercollages that kind of map the biodiversity and the ecology of the area. But there was a twist, which was that I was also speculating which species could have been there based on the habitat and the available food sources if it wasn't for human habitation and intervention into the landscape. And then I kind of marked their absence by including their presence, but in the form of the skulls. So yeah, at this point I was already working with natural history specimens, but they were already preserved.
So you were really already kind of going down the route you're in today then in 2016.
I think that was certainly where it started. Yes. Yeah. But I think I've been on that path probably, my whole life. There was a pivotal moment that came though when one day I was driving along and I saw an SUV hit a laughing dove. And I was a wildlife rehab volunteer in South Africa, so I pulled over to assess the situation. And the dove was still alive when I picked it up, but then it spasmed terribly and died in my hands.
How sad.
I was filled with so much rage because they didn't stop, and also just sorrow for the situation. So I took their little body home with me, and I created a photograph and an accompanying poem called Ode to the Laughing Dove.
Oh. I, for one, certainly would love to hear this poem, and I'm sure the listeners would too. Would that be possible, Natalie? Do you have it?
I do.
Do you remember it?
I actually have it on my desktop because I was worried that I was going to lose it the other day, and when I was talking about it, so I resaved it, so yeah, I can
that would be lovely.
Do a reading of that. Okay.
Yes, please.
Ode to the Laughing Dove. A moment of hesitation, and you will fly no more. For here comes a human in a travel machine. No time to pause. I did not see the traveller. I only saw you tumble, thrash against the tarred earth in anguish, your head contorted back against outspread wings, a torturous scene imprinted on my soul, forevermore. I pulled my own machine up alongside you, cupped my hands around you, to keep you still, so I could help you. But crimson trickled from your beak, and in that terrifying moment, we looked at each other in the eyes and shared awareness, in that moment when life left you. Did you know the look of compassion in my eyes? Someone cared for you as you died. And I held you in that instant, as though through a will of life force I could turn back that awful moment in time. But here, in my hands you lie, where you will laugh no more, and I can only cry.
Goodness me, Natalie. This certainly tells me a lot. It seems to be a defining moment for you. Would you say that this experience impacted your work?
Oh, most certainly. Because in a way it broke a barrier. I hadn't worked with physical dead animal bodies before. And after that, I continued working with them when I found them, always with a focus on the fact that they are indeed dead. But of course, they're not taxidermied. So I always had a limited time that I could spend with these decaying creatures. And I wanted to learn natural history conservation techniques so that I had more options in how I work with them and how I can actually tell these stories. And so that's why I applied to the Trondheim Art Academy kit, specifically because it functions in the framework of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU, which houses its own natural history museum. Yeah, so my application to kit indicated my interest in exploring the dead animal body as an artistic medium by learning conservation techniques at that department. But sadly, that did not work out quite as planned.
Oh no.
But don't worry, Instagram came to the rescue. Yeah.
Right.
In a moment of desperation, I just tried to Google and find as many taxidermists in this area, and of course they're not many. And I found Guus Vellesen at Arctic Skeletons and made contact with him. And he's actually the only bone articulating taxidermist in Scandinavia, and a European champion at that. And yet he was very delightful, has always been the most generous person. And within 1 month of me contacting him, and the master program starting, I was actually embedded in this world of specimen conservation at his place of work, which is the Department of Clinical and Molecular Medicine, also at NTNU. And I actually work there today.
How exciting, and not least impressive. I mean, thanks to social media, it worked out, one could say.
It did, yes.
That is funny. But again, you know, seeing the power social media has today, it tells a lot too.
Yes.
I would love it if you could explain to us what you yourself mean about speculative taxidermy, what it means to you in your artistic process.
Sure. So, I'm not the first person to use taxidermy as an artistic medium. So there have been several art movements in this genre, including botched taxidermy, which I think is quite a famous art movement. And if you don't know it, it's worth looking at. But then more recently, there was speculative taxidermy. So that was a term coined by art historian Giovanni Alloy in 2018. It's also the title of his book, which I highly recommend. And he uses it to describe art in which preserved animal materials are incorporated with the explicit aim to rethink human-animal relationships. Whereas botched taxidermy is often seemed more gratuitous and excessive in a way. I think that speculative taxidermy has a much subtler approach in which it focuses on the respect of the animal and bridging a gap between the human and the non-human. There are numerous examples of artists working with this, but the ones that have piqued my interest the most are the ones that I've exhibited in natural history museums in order to recontextualize the spaces that they're placed in.
Leaving behind the white cube.
Yes, exactly. I was lucky enough to see 2 such artworks myself, which really impacted my artistic preferences, I suppose, like motivating me to move off the printed page, like away from the light-based, lens-based art and into real life to create 3-dimensional artworks and sculptures.
Right.
Just like life-changing experiences, and you don't even really know that it's happening at the time.
No, it happens.
Yeah. So the first one was Tessa Farmer's The Fairy Horde and the Hedgehog, which I saw at the Museum of Old and New Art in Tasmania, which I believe is your hometown.
Yes, Tassie.
I love Tassie. It's beautiful there. And then the second was Claire Morgan's By the Skin of the Teeth, which I saw at the Horniman Museum in London in 2019. And that's like, I cried when I saw that artwork. It's really moved me into the depths of my soul. And I actually have an excerpt here from the field note that I took on the day that I would love to read for your listeners, if that would be okay.
I can answer on behalf of us all, and yes, please do.
Okay. Field note, 30 September 2019. Upon entering the Great Hall of the Horniman Museum, I was confronted by something unexpected. A squirrel, fox, raven and parakeet hung suspended, maws and beaks agape, each with a spiraling cone of small pieces of black plastic spewing from their mouths. This image has stayed with me. What makes this work so impactful? Is it the juxtaposition of the natural and man-made materials and the tension created at the point of their intersection? Or the unexpected confrontation with our own culpability in creating an uninhabitable planet for other species? So for my master thesis project, I wanted to kind of recreate this kind of experience for other people, this experience that I had, by extending the range of artistic intervention from the Natural History Museum, which had already been done before and is perhaps a place where people expect to be confronted with issues about human-animal relationships, and move that to cultural museums, where taxidermied animals are actually present, but obscured by the exceptionalism of man, right? So if you think like the ready-made in an artwork or the skin on a drum or the fur of a coat, they're there, but you don't really notice them because your focus is on this beautiful artifact.
So when did you graduate?
Last year, so pretty recently.
Oh, it was last.
That already feels like a lifetime ago.
Congratulations then.
Thank you. My thesis
Can you
has
maybe
also
tell
just
us-
been published, actually, last month
Oh, right.
in the Finnish Journal of Arts and Education. So it is available if anybody would like to read it.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you for that. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit more about your master thesis? I'd love to learn more about that.
Gladly, but I shall warn you that it does get a little bit complicated. But I'm going to explain it as best as I can. Okay, so my master
Thank
thesis argues that the representation of animal materialities in art and artifacts has the potential to reform culture in the time of the sixth extinction. So, in other words, I look at how we represent animals in culture, whether that be on a two-dimensional surface or in three-dimensional, embedded into cultural artifacts, in film, in all the ways in which we experience animals. And then I try to make a commentary on that through my artwork, which kind of becomes an antithesis of the culture that is currently the norm. So I reimagine the narratives that we tell about animals through my work. And I created this project called Museum of Extinction, the Field Ornithology Collection, as a commentary against museum representations of animals. But yeah, so this is a very interdisciplinary project that called for partners in both natural history conservation, which I arranged through the apprenticeship with Velison, but then also museology. Because in order for one to reimagine historical representations of the animal other, you need to explore artifacts and archives to see how they are hidden underneath layers of human exceptionalism. So how do you actually make the animal present when the only thing people see is the drum? So I was fortunate enough to get access to the Museene Isurtrondelag's collections and knowledge base as one of two recipients of their scholarship program in 2022. And that enabled me to study the representation of animals in art at the Trondheim Kunstmuseum, in artifacts and cultural heritage at the Sverresborg Folk Museum, decorative arts and crafts at the Nordenfeldske Kunstindustrie Museum.
Tongue twister.
Sorry, I know. It's my best Norwegian, and then also at the musical instruments at the Ringve Music Museum. So I did quite an extensive research. I think I looked at 22 different artifacts. And so working with these institutions, I was looking at how artistic intervention can actually support the role of the museum as a custodian of natural heritage and not just cultural heritage, by taking a critical position on how animals are represented in such spaces. And I must just
interesting.
say,
Continue.
So I just want to, they were incredibly supportive of this project, and
it's so good to hear.
Allowed me to bring these criticisms into their space, for the public to see. So I think that it was really good to know that the museums also want to change these stories. They were open to it, and I think that's a very important and powerful position to work from.
That makes me so happy to hear. Coming in with it, as a master student.
Yeah. So that was kind of like the research element of it. And then we also had the practical side where I actually had to create an artwork. So I created my own speculative museum, which is based in the future, along with the physical artifacts that will in due time, populate its halls. And there was a physical manifestation of this museum at the Valfschilleren at Tripmansgate Kunst in Trondheim in 2023.
May I just point out that this is where I became truly intrigued by you and your artistic work, seeing it there.
I'm so happy to hear that you saw it in person. As you know, there's this collection of artistic animal artifacts. I think there's 5 artifacts in that show. And they explicitly incorporate dead birds posed in various stages of decay to draw our attention to narratives around extinction. But because these sculptures also represent like cultural objects, they have the potential to simulate like relics from the past and can be used for artistic intervention into these cultural institutions. So my hypothetical museum loaned the artifacts to museums in the present in order to create like a site-responsive artistic intervention similar to that of Claire Morgan, that recontextualizes these existing narratives that we have around human-animal relationships. So the first museum that was like an early adopter of the concept was the Ringva Music Museum. And they had this artwork Birdcage, which was designed specifically to comment on exotic animal bodies that are embedded in the instrument collection. And, you know, of course, I'm very curious. So I wanted to like be there and gauge like the public reaction to the intervention. So I supplemented it with a thematic tour guided by future human April Rain. That's me.
Yeah. I love this. Just
so
thinking about that.
Spy on them. Yeah. So that was quite fun.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's just so complex the way you think out your projects and your work. It's mesmerizing as well. You really go all in. I mean, it's a deep dive for you in so many ways and a lot of work.
Yeah, like I said, it can get quite complicated, even sometimes for me. But yeah, I do enjoy a good narrative or a story, you know, like if your character has to have a backstory. You can't just have a thing. Yes, there has to be a before and after in any good storytelling. So, yeah. I do plan on becoming April Rain though.
Okay.
That's the next step. It's called becoming the crone. Yeah. April Rain is 99-year-old me. So that's a different story for a different day. Yeah.
Well, we just have to continue following you, that's for sure.
Just going to have to keep watching the space.
Where you're going from there. So for me, Natalie, it sounds like you are more focused on the scientific research here than maybe the artistic research. Is that okay for me to say? Is that something you agree right now, here and now in your life?
No, because I think that artistic research is to some extent scientific research. We are using the same methodologies as scientists. You know, we using the scientific method in some ways to gather qualitative information, not necessarily quantitative. But there is definitely a sense, I think, in the larger artist community that artistic research is becoming a valid form of art. And in academia, the preferred form of art, actually. But I do think that there is an equal amount of artistry in the storytelling, the sculptures, the making, as there is in the research part of it. The research is just there to inform the final outcome, maybe.
Well, yeah. I mean, could you maybe elaborate a bit more about your artistic process and how that works out for you?
Sure. So, I mean, I do think a big part of my work is conceptual and research-based. But as for the taxidermy itself, for starters, it's a little graphic and disturbing. You know, I had never actually taxidermied an animal before I decided to take on an apprenticeship. So I don't actually know what I thought was going to happen there. But here we are. So here is always where we have to start from. So I've worked mostly with birds, using taxidermy and skeleton articulation in various forms. That's probably not always agreeable with people who do it professionally. For the taxidermy, of course, you have to keep the skin intact. That's the main focus. So you're removing the intestines, the meat, and some of the bones. But then you're also saving the bones of the wings and the legs, which will be bonded with wire to become like the armature that you use for posing the animal body. And then, of course, you've got to keep the form. So you've got to replace the material that you take out. So I use polyurethane and also wood and clay and various materials. So I stuff it before I sew it together. But then I'm also experimenting with working only with the skin, and also like deconstructing the bird completely so that it almost becomes formless in a way. Yeah, I think it's really important to learn the rules just so that you can break them, right?
True.
And I do think because I'm new at the medium, I am still very much staying inside the lines because I am trying to figure out how it actually works, how to do it properly. And I think as I become more comfortable with the processes, I will definitely move away from it as a taxidermy more and more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm still trying to figure it out, I've only been doing it for 2.5 years, so yeah.
It takes time to learn, yeah.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, there's also the skeleton work, and that's actually quite a lengthy process. It takes about 4 to 12 weeks to clean the bones. So you have 3 stages. There's the maceration, where you soak the bones until the meat falls off, but you can use like an enzyme to help that along. And then there's also like whitening and degreasing. And then, of course, you have to painstakingly re-articulate the skeleton. But my anatomy is maybe at this point still not good enough to do that 100% on my own. Some of the bones all look the same to me. But my favorite thing is to actually just use it creatively and build new structures. So like I did for the birdcage that was exhibited at the Ringde Music Museum, where you kind of just follow the material and just allow it to guide you in what you want to make. And I think that's definitely more a form of artistry than taxidermy on its own.
I would say so as well. Then you're coming back to the artist part because there's a lot of extensive work going on behind what you're doing here. Very thorough.
Yeah. It's also very explorative. I'm teaching myself new things, or actually Velison's teaching me new things on a constant basis. Yeah. And I get to see things that, I'd never even thought about. So the one day I was butchering a hen and I found a clutch of eggs inside her, which looked almost like a bunch of grapes, going from like really larger ones all the way to like tiny small ones that was forming against the wall of the cervix, I suppose. And so that was quite sad actually, because it's like unborn eggs, but we eat eggs, so it's a different story also. And then the next day I was working on a canary and I found one tiny single egg in the canary, so you just kind of become more familiar also with like, I don't know, like the reproductive processes of different animals. And yeah, it really is a fascinating experience every time, and you see and learn new things. So
for sure. You're obviously very passionate about nature, and could one say that this has always been the case for you?
Yeah, I've always been very curious about the world around me. According to my mom, even as a child, before I can remember, I was collecting insects in little boxes and making beetle stew. And she literally had to move the insect boxes down from my bed so I could get in at night. So this has been an ongoing thing where I like to play outside in the dirt. But then, of course, there are moments in life that you veer off the road. So as a teenager, my focus was more on being like the cool kids. But then when I was backpacking, I kind of came back on track. And then I had a commercial photography business. So I was maybe not spending that same amount of time and interest on the natural world. But then in 2016, I had a bit of a reality check, which made me reanalyze my life. And later that same year, I was fortunate enough to have the artist residency in Finland.
Right.
And during that time, I would just wander into the forest and imagine what would it be like if I died and just lay here and decay and return to nature. because when you think about it, like the earth and the oceans and plants and animals, and even our bodies have evolved from the remnants of ancient celestial stars that have existed since the beginning of time. And we are quite literally stardust.
That's
swirling and forming.
and very, very true. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're just like swirling and forming temporary shapes and dissolving and shape shifting into something new. And it dawned on me that my body would become like one with the soil and then be consumed by a worm, which could be caught by a bird. And then one day the bird will die and fall to the ground and be reconsumed by the earth in like this endless, like ancient cycle. Like I really like that idea of eternity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so my life mission is just to protect this thing that I think I'm part of, like nature. And I don't only do it through my art. Like I also worked as a wildlife rehabilitation volunteer for the last 8 years that I lived in Johannesburg. And I think that experience really opened my eyes to like the incredible biodiversity and life that's just like there in like this bustling city of 5 million people. It's like nature is just like on your doorstep. It's like the earth under your feet and the creatures that fill the sky above you. And you don't actually have to travel or backpack or like do this fancy thing to get to it. Like you literally just have to invite it in, like restore a little bit of habitat, like growing a meadow instead of a lawn, and like create opportunities for encounters like of a wilder kind. Yeah. And I think like when I was working at FFW, like seeing that tangible impact that a small community of individuals that put in like 4 hours or so a week can make, like seeing that, I can't help but wonder, like what would the planet look like if we all 8 billion of us just like volunteered for 4 hours a week and created like the change that we want to see in the world.
That's a really good point. Gosh, which comes to make me think about like which current projects are you working on right now, or any upcoming ones you might want to share with us?
Yeah, I have a few exciting projects still lined up for 2024. First up, I'm working on an installation at Rotterdam Kunstnercollectief Gallery for the Kunstfest, which we will be hosting on the 24th of August. It's a day and night affair filled with art and concerts of all kind, and I can highly recommend it to art lovers and music lovers alike. This will also be my second experiment this year that I've designed to gather information for a large-scale kind of dream project that I'm hoping to fulfill in like the coming maybe 2 to 3 years. It's quite ambitious. It's called The Murder of Crows. We'll see if it happens.
Wow.
Yeah. I also plan on doing some further research for that project through a fellowship with Future Conserve, which hasn't been announced yet, but will be starting next month. And it will be for 9 months, culminating in March 2025. Yeah, if you haven't heard of them, actually you might be interested in them because it's a growing community of artists, designers, writers, scientists, and then like also traditional knowledge holders that are working at the intersection of art and science to kind of cultivate new pathways for wildlife conservation and like bring matters around biodiversity loss to the forefront. And they actually host a mentorship program annually, which is how I kind of became aware of them. So I was a mentee in my last 6 months of my master's program. So now I'm going to do a fellowship about documenting pathways, and I will be creating a map of previous Future Conserve mentee projects to draw a correlation between like art methodologies and environmental pedagogy. So I'm exploring how we come to know things through research, but then how do we share that knowledge through practice and teaching? So I'll be testing like various qualitative methodologies, which includes things like soundscaping and walking and mapping and drawing, and then applying them to my own research project. So I can like try and like get a different perspective or maybe like do research in a way that I haven't done before. So I'm quite excited about that. But then most importantly, I'm also trying to make space for nothing, for just experimentation and play, like you can't fill up every minute of every day.
Exactly, which is also so important. Yeah. But anyway, this fellowship is a global online community, isn't it? Or it's based, or where is it
Yes.
based exactly? Do you know?
I think they're based in the US somewhere, but the mentees and the fellows and everybody is situated all across the globe. So
Yeah.
you have people from Nepal and Australia and Singapore and Ecuador, and it's such a great experience because you get to see into the lives of different cultures and how people are activating across the globe for change, which I find really hopeful, and I'm very happy to be a part of that community.
A great learning perspective, I'm sure.
Definitely.
So how do you see your work reshaping the future we want to live in, considering the power that, design has to shape things?
Yeah, as artists and designers, we are very much at the forefront of culture. So I believe that we have the power to influence cultural trends and deliver creative solutions for a more sustainable future.
So true. Thank you so much, Natalie, for sharing your insights and story with us today. It's been such a pleasure to learn about your work and your creative process. And I, for one, am certainly looking forward to seeing more and hearing more about you in the near future.
Thank you so much for having me, Tanya. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share my message with anyone who's willing to listen. So thanks.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to the Artful Exchange. If you would like to learn more about Natalie and follow her, please have a look in our description post under this specific podcast, where we will be posting all her social media links and website information. And until then, stay creative and inspired.